Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Ken Greenberg is a renowned urbanist, urban planner, smart guy, and a real great commentator about what's going on in Toronto, Canada, the world. But recently, Toronto. He listed just recently 12 reasons why the Ontario Science Centre should not be moved to Ontario Place, and so I needed to reach out to him and hear what the 12 reasons are. Ken, nice to see you. Welcome to the show, sir.
I'm really pleased to be here.
What are your 12 reasons?
So I have to say, like many people, I was kind of shocked when this announcement was suddenly sprung. There had been rumors about it, but all of a sudden it appeared that it was a fait accompli,
Yep.
that the Ontario Science Centre would be demolished, that in its place housing would be built, and the whole thing just started to unravel. So I thought about why this was such a bad idea, and I ended up jotting down 12 things, and there obviously are more. But let me start with the fact that some 50 years ago, under a progressive conservative government in this province, and when Metropolitan Toronto had just been created, we came to the really sensible conclusion that we shouldn't have all the cultural institutions piled on in the heart of downtown Toronto, that we're a big city region, that people live throughout the region, and that these assets should be dispersed and they should occur in different places in our city. And one of these was the Ontario Science Centre. And in fact, the government commissioned Raymond Moriyama, noted architect of the day, who developed a really innovative, interesting building, Don Mills, up at near Eglinton and Don Mills Road, right on the edge of the Don Valley, stepping down into the valley, the beautiful escalator that took people down into the valley. So the connection to nature was obvious, and it has been a popular asset for years. So my first reason is that made sense then, and it still makes sense now. And why on earth would we abandon that idea and suggest that everything had to be piled on in one place in downtown Toronto?
Arguably, I think it makes even more sense today than it did at the time.
Absolutely. And it makes even more sense. One of my other reasons is, to the extent that it was somewhat isolated and depended on access by car with parking lots, guess what? We're now building the Ontario line, a new subway line, which will go from Exhibition Place, Liberty Village, Ontario Place, down on the lake to the Ontario Science Centre.
And ironically, the last station is called?
It is called Ontario Science Centre. Surprise, surprise. And on top of that, we're building the Eglinton Crosstown, which comes to that same station. So it's an intermodal station, LRT and subway right there. And we also have other interesting things happening at that node. We have the Aga Khan Museum, we have the Japanese Cultural Center, and we have new housing for about 25,000 to 30,000 people being built right now as we speak at the four corners of Don Mills and Eglinton.
25,000 people.
Something like 25,000 if you count up all the development applications and all the construction that is happening now. This former Celestica site, which is renamed Winford Heights, and the other corners. So my second reason was, what's interesting is that over the years, the communities of Flemington Park and Thorncliffe Park, these are communities largely of new Canadians coming from all over the world, have formed intimate relationships with the Ontario Science Centre. And their kids, and not only kids, have been using the facility. They can walk there in many cases. A lot of the programming has been developed in association with the local neighborhoods, with the schools, and they have all really spoken up and said it would be a tremendous loss for our communities. In fact, it was proving the first point about dispersal.
And Ontario Place, in contrast, is completely divorced from any community, any neighborhood, correct?
It's Liberty Village is several hundred meters away on the other side of the railway tracks, but it certainly doesn't have that kind of immediate relationship, particularly to communities of people who benefit enormously in the way that has happened in Don Mills. I mentioned already the fact that it is now in the heart of a growing community. That was my reason number 3. I mentioned the new station. That was reason number 4. The other thing that came out is that when the government made this announcement, bizarrely, seemingly, they had never consulted with the Conservation Authority. The Conservation Authority, the authorities were set up after Hurricane Hazel, when we had devastating flooding, particularly on the Humber River, but also revealing the vulnerability of all of our rivers, including the Don River. And so we wisely said people should not be in harm's way. And we established areas called hazard lands, which are prone to flooding. And it turns out that the 81 acres where the Premier was talking about building housing cannot be built upon because they fall within the hazard lands. So the Conservation Authority spoke up, and they were extremely surprised, had never been consulted, to learn of this proposal. We'll stop for a moment, get rid of the phone call.
Hello.
The Conservation Authority.
What about the Conservation Authority?
The Conservation Authority was completely surprised, in fact, ambushed by this announcement that new housing could be developed within the hazard lands. And so they have spoken up and said it's simply not possible. Another thing that was said was that the Premier said, well, the staff of the Ontario Science Centre, the facility is old, it's decrepit, it's a mess, it can't be used, and the staff are really excited about moving to a brand new facility down on the lake. Well, again, the staff were not consulted. They were extremely surprised. They were already working on a proposal not to demolish the existing Ontario Science Centre. On the contrary, they've been fighting all along for budgets to do the necessary repairs, in particular to put the bridge back in a state of good repair into the valley so it can be used, and to upgrade their programs. They've been starved for resources, but what they were thinking about was an additional science-oriented set of programs down on the waterfront. Perfectly good idea, in the pods of the Ontario Science Centre, not as a replacement, but as an addition, as a complement to what is at their existing facility at Don Mills. So another group of people who've spoken
We're consulted.
up. We're not consulted, who've spoken up. Then we come to the architecture itself, this seeming casual dismissal of the work of Raymond Moriyama. And here the Toronto Society of Architects, the Moriyama and Tashima office have spoken up. Architects in general are speaking up with dismay and, dare I say, outrage at the idea that this icon, 54 years old, can simply be demolished. I think the government, again, made that announcement with zero consultation, is backing off and coming up with things like, well, maybe we can turn it into a community center or something else, none of which really make any sense. And the people from the area are saying, look, we're already getting this immense amount of new housing. We're already getting a new transit location. We're not just a bedroom dormitory. We are a community. We deserve to have cultural assets as a vital heart of our community as well. And so that becomes a really important point. Just practically, if you were to destroy this building, which represents a very particular period in the modern movement, referred to as brutalism, it's a certain way of treating the concrete. It's a outstanding example of that period. It can easily be upgraded with contemporary programs, contemporary technology, new uses, which honor the architecture. But the embodied energy in the building, if you were to demolish it and send all the broken concrete to a landfill, is astonishing. It's, somebody has pointed out, it's like the amount of energy used in 50,000 transatlantic flights. which would be lost if one were to do that. The next reason is you don't have to destroy the Ontario Science Museum to do the housing. In fact, the only place you can build the housing out of harm's way is up on what are called the tablelands, out of the hazard lands, up along Don Mills Road. There are a series of parking lots. And in those parking lots, now that we have the new transit station, there's a perfect opportunity to build new housing, mixed income housing with a significant amount of affordable housing that become an adjunct to the existing neighborhood, where there can be a community amenities that would make the entry sequence into the Ontario Science Centre even better, where you could have restaurants, you could have cafes, you can have shops, you can have all the things that would give it more of a neighborhood orientation. And then my last two reasons are looking at what was proposed. Let's just pick the Science Centre up holus bolus and move it down to the lake. Well, what they're talking about is a facility, and they don't say this very much. You have to dig into the announcements to realize this. It's less than half the size of the existing Science Centre. So who decided that it should be cut in half? How did they arrive at that decision? And then erroneously, again, in a misleading way, they kept saying, well, you're going to get a brand new facility. Well, in fact, what they were showing is the adaptive reuse of the pods of the Zeidler building, which is it's much more complicated, good idea in some ways, but much more complicated than upgrading the existing building. So that didn't make sense. And then lastly, if you look at the diagrams and the preliminary diagrams for how would you insert the Ontario Science Centre, which comes as a kind of afterthought next to the gigantic therm mega spa, which is proposed for the West Island of Ontario Place, which is the size of, according to one of its designers, that mega spa. If you can picture in your mind's eye BMO Field Stadium, the volume with the stands as an object, that's how big it is. In fact, it's been described as bigger than that. So picture lifting that up, moving it across Lakeshore Boulevard, plopping it down where it occupies the entire West Island, and then adding another area in the water as big again as the West Island to compensate. This version of the Science Centre that they were proposing has a little entry pavilion on Lakeshore Boulevard, which looks, I called it a saddlebag, nestled up against the gigantic pavilion for the mega spa, which it sits next to. And then to get to what they're proposing as a Science Centre, you have to dive into a tunnel along the edge of a parking garage for over 2,000 cars, which the government is proposing to build for the spa. Go down into a tunnel, then come back up again from the tunnel, back up to street level, then back up again to get to the bridge, which is hidden behind the entry pavilion, the ticketing pavilion for the spa, to make your way to the pods. So it's an awful plan. So you get a smaller Science Centre, half the size, with a plan that is crunched up against the mega spa, awkward to access, awkward to service. Everything about it doesn't make sense.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Ken Greenberg and delve into these 12 reasons why moving the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place, in his mind, doesn't make any sense. Really good critique, sir. Thank you very much. We'll be back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is the Ontario Science Centre. We're also going to talk, I presume, a little bit about Ontario Place, because that's where it's proposed to go by the current proposal from the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, the Doug Ford government. My guest is Ken Greenberg. I got to tell you, it's an incredible honor to be chatting with Ken Greenberg today. He is an urban designer, a teacher, a writer, a former director of urban design and architecture for the City of Toronto, and he's principal of Greenberg Consultants. He has, for over 4 decades, played a pivotal role on public and private assignments in urban settings across North America and Europe. focusing on the rejuvenation of downtowns, waterfronts, neighborhoods, and on-campus master planning, regional growth management, and new community planning. I became aware of Mr. Greenberg during my chairmanship of the Mississauga City Summit, and he got involved in some of the planning and talking about what was going on in Mississauga, and he was unbelievably inspirational in his desire to create a more walkable urban environment. He's actually the author of a book. I think it's called The Walkable City that I've enjoyed reading. And
Walking Home, actually.
Walking Home. I apologize.
No.
And you have, sir, I think provided over, in addition to all of your work for so many other people, really good commentary to the people of the Greater Toronto Area on building the kind of community that we want to have. That is this vision of a walkable, bikeable, livable, enjoyable city that is something that I think we all, when we listen to you, aspire to. But too often we just don't seem to be able to achieve it. We keep on messing it up somehow. And so thank you for the work that you've done, both for all the different organizations that you've worked for, but particularly for your critiques in public at time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
On this topic, let me ask you about some of the issues that you've raised, if we could. Let's go back to the rationale for this Ontario line and the development and the Eglinton Crosstown and the development around the former Celestica building. My father actually moved from Montreal back in the 1960s to take a job at IBM, which was the original tenant of that grassy knoll in the area between Don Mills and I think it's Leslie, and it really has transformed. And I see some of the proposed developments at Bayview, at Don Mills, at Laird, even on the other side of the Don Valley Parkway, because of, number one, the proposed Eglinton Crosstown that seems like it's never going to open. And that's a whole nother topic we could discuss. But also because of now the Ontario line. And it's going to dramatically transform that whole area. Is it not? That whole stretch from really Yonge Street, but maybe, from Mount Pleasant or Bayview, all the way to past the Don Valley Parkway, every single one of the intersections of the Eglinton Crosstown, and particularly where the Ontario line is going to bisect, because of major transit, is, and frankly should, dramatically develop anyway. And it's therefore going to become incredibly dense, not just at Don Mills, but everywhere along that line, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting that is happening, and I think it's a very positive thing, is our whole city region, and this was true throughout North America, is shifting from a model where you had one extraordinarily dense, powerful, what was called a central business district, surrounded by bedroom dormitory suburbs, and all being served by a combination of highways and then commuter rail, all in a radial pattern, all aimed at this one destination. And it was based on a 9 to 5 days a week kind of work schedule. And COVID has revealed what was already happening with hybrid work, with people being exhausted by long commutes before COVID, where we're moving to a different kind of live-work relationship. And what that is propelling is an idea where people will live and work throughout the region, not all sleep in one place and work in another place, but actually do both everywhere. So we're ending up with a regional city. Mississauga City Center is a perfect example, which you're very familiar with, but all throughout the 905, we're getting these hubs that are wired by higher order transit, like the LRT, the Hazel McCallion LRT coming up here, Ontario, from Port Credit, going up to Brampton. The Eglinton Crosstown is another example where it becomes a kind of web instead of this single radial pattern. And the Ontario line, going from Exhibition Place, Liberty Village, and Ontario Place to the Ontario Science Center, was another one of those cross-cutting, diagonal, in that case, transportation connections, so people could move in every direction across and around the city region. It's kind of like if you look at the transit plan for Paris, between the RER, the commuter rail, and the metro, it goes every which way, and you can get from every place to every place. What we're hopefully moving to is something that makes that more possible. And then, as you say, Brian, what's happening is at all those stops along the way, all those stations, you're getting this mix of people living and working. So at the former Celestica site that you were mentioning, it's not all housing. There actually will be employment. And as I mentioned before, you have institutions like the Aga Khan Museum, which is going to have its own stop on the Aga Khan Crosstown, one stop beyond the Science Center stop. This is a healthy thing. This is a good thing. And what's really interesting about the Ontario line is, in addition to what I've just said, it connects two of the most significant natural features in our city region, Lake Ontario at the west end, and then following the diagonal northeast, the Don Valley, the Don River Valley, our ravines, our great other natural feature feeding into Lake Ontario. And so access to all these places is improved, and they all become interesting places to live and work, and finding that balance. So every trip doesn't have to be, to buy your groceries or to get to daycare or go to school for kids, something where you have to travel out of your neighborhood, and places for people to work in their neighborhoods. And the people in Flemington Park and Thorncliffe Park are saying, we don't only want more housing, we also want places to work. We want jobs, we want amenities, and we want this great cultural center, the Science Center, in our midst.
So what you're speaking to is, excuse me, do you want a city where everything is in one spot or spread out and have different nodes? And it's something that we've been, I think, in the Metro Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area, been working for a long time to try to create these other employment nodes, maybe not as big central business districts as downtown Toronto, but central business districts. And I think it's something that makes sense. Let me ask you about sort of the co-location of different tourist and recreational amenities. You may not know, but I used to work for the Walt Disney Company. I was very involved in work associated with amusement parks, and I also was very involved in looking at building a new arena in Ottawa for the Ottawa Senators downtown. And lots of people have done studies on tourist attractions, and if the stay is a partial day stay, where you'll have other activities that you want to do logically before and after, then it makes sense to co-locate them because they're incredibly synergistic. So for example, an arena, people want to go out for dinner before and they want to go out for drinks afterwards. And so therefore, having it in a suburban location in the middle of a parking lot with no bars or restaurants nearby doesn't make a lot of sense because you lose out on all that synergistic value. Having a theme park where there's no opportunities to do, recreational activities during the evening, or hotels that can house you when you want to stay doesn't make sense. And so therefore you end up having this synergistic activities. The Smithsonian in Washington, because you had numerous different museums that were all an hour to a 2-hour stay, made sense to locate close by together because people were going to go to one, then they were going to go to another, then they were going to go another. And the example in Toronto would probably be the ROM and the Planetarium, that people might go to both on a similar visit. Clifton Hill and Niagara Falls, the average length of stay at Niagara Falls is something like 45 minutes. And so therefore it makes sense to go gamble or go to Clifton Hill on your same visit. Otherwise it's a waste of a day to go the whole way just for 45 minutes. The Ontario Science Center is something very different than all those examples, though, isn't it? It's a destination kind of place. The vast majority of people that I think go there are school students, and they're going for a good field trip, and they're not going to go for a bar afterwards or a restaurant before, and they're probably not going to be going shopping or going on an amusement ride. It doesn't make any sense to locate it beside a spa, does it? There's no synergistic value of co-locating. So the whole rationale for co-location in a common area, I just don't think makes any logical business sense. Just as a pure businessman, it doesn't make sense, does it?
No, it is a very strange, awkward, and I think dysfunctional kind of co-location. Co-location is important for all the reasons you've said. And I think if I can look at both ends of the line, so to speak, just talk about the Science Center at Don Mills for a moment. I think when families go there, you know, and my wife and I have grandkids in the city, and you know, our kids went to Science Center and went to Ontario Place. It's nice to have other things nearby. Certainly not a spa, but you know, you might want to take the family out for a meal. In the case of being located on the Don Valley, a beautiful form of co-location now, and I worked on this trail when I was director of architecture and urban design for the city of Toronto. The bike trail that comes up the Don Valley, that goes all the way from the waterfront up to Edwards Gardens and beyond, is right there, right next to the Science Center. So people actually being able to access the valley, and one way of getting there is on a bike trip with a family, is fantastic. I think having some additional things at the doorstep on Don Mills, where a family could go to a restaurant or a cafe or do a few other things, make perfect sense. So some level of co-location would be interesting for the Science Center. Going back to the spa, the very logic for having that spa on the waterfront is so strange and weak. The business model for the spa, and this is why this gigantic entry pavilion on Lakeshore Boulevard is built, is that people come, they wanted the 2,000 plus car garage right there. They come out of their cars, they go up, buy their tickets, or however else they come. They go inside the spa, 65,000 square feet. That's the size of one of the towers at King and Bay. If you took all that floor space and put it into a big shoebox, that's what you would have. All of the food and beverage, all of the things, you know, going to the various, it's divided like a cruise ship by classes. You have the upper class, middle class, the hoi polloi and steerage down at the bottom, although it's still $40 a ticket. They never go outside. It sits on the island and it's hermetically sealed. So the people inside get to peer out the windows at the public, and the public gets to look inside the windows. But all of the amenities inside are not available to the public on a narrow edge around the spa. So literally it could and should be anywhere but on the waterfront. I think the only reason that they want to have it on the waterfront is for the beauty shot, that you can photograph it looking across the water, but you can't get inside. And so saying that the Science Center would be right next to it, as you quite accurately point out, the idea of people combining going to be pampered in the spa with a trip to the Science Center is just a strange one. What people will do is, and they are doing, is using our whole waterfront. So you're in Mississauga. What Mississauga is doing with its waterfront is magnificent. And the whole length of the Lake Ontario shoreline, I'll start in Hamilton, from Cootes Paradise, Burlington, Oakville, Mississauga, formerly Etobicoke, the Humber Bay, all the way across the city of Toronto, into Scarborough, over to Ajax, Pickering. It all is becoming this wonderful amenity that tens of millions of people are accessing. And these are people who don't have cottages, for whom Lake Ontario is their resort. And they're using it in wonderful ways. On any decent day, it's crowded everywhere. And even when the weather is not so great, people are using it. And so when Ontario Place was conceived, it was conceived by John Robarts and Bill Davis, the premiers of the day, as a great waterfront amenity. It was a response to Expo 67 in Montreal and the great success that had for Canada, a moment of great optimism and delight in rediscovering the St. Lawrence River in the case of Montreal. And so we did the same on Lake Ontario. And they hired these two brilliant designers, Eberhard Zeidler and Michael Huff, who had never worked together, incidentally. And each was a really interesting leader in their own field. Michael was one of the world pioneers in design with nature. He wrote a very influential book to that effect. And so the idea of shaping a landscape this archipelago of islands that would protect for climate, for wind, for wave action, and allow people to be on the lake was a great invention. And Ebb Zeidler was experimenting as an architect, and one of the few examples of built examples in the world, with some theories that were then very active in architectural circles around exposing structure, the idea that this was inspired by bridges, by suspension cables, and resting very lightly on the water, on the land, on stilts. And you put those two things together and something magic happened. And then we lost sight of that for decades. People got this completely misguided idea that Ontario Place somehow shouldn't be seen as a public amenity, as a public park on the waterfront, the way the people had conceived it, who created it, but it should be a piece of real estate to be monetized. And so they agonized over how do we make money out of this? How do we turn it into a business? And in the meantime, they starved it for resources. But what happened, especially during, and they essentially closed it as a theme park, but people began to use it as a park. And so in the last 3 years of COVID, over 1.5 million people have been going down there every year. I sent you some photographs of the incredible number of ways in which people are using it, enjoying it in all 4 seasons, including swimming on one of the cleanest beaches along the lakefront. Trillium Park is a wonderful example of indigenous inspiration with great landscape architecture and being inspired by Michael Huff. And so the proof is in the pudding, and it's right there before us. It also turns out that Ontario Place is within the territory of Waterfront Toronto, this agency that we created 21 years ago, combining the resources from all 3 orders of government and doing a magnificent job at opening up public space along our waterfront. They incidentally collaborated with Infrastructure Ontario to build Trillium Park. So we had the idea, we had the proof of concept with Trillium Park at the eastern end of Ontario Place, and we had the burgeoning population of the region with a tremendous desire to have access to public space. And then finally, we know that from an economic standpoint, the return on investment to the public, to the city region, of having great public parks, great resources. Think of Central Park in New York, think of Golden Gate in Montreal, think of the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris, Chapultepec in Mexico City. These are the things that we all go to see when we go to see those cities. And this is a reason why businesses locate there. This is why people want to live there. So to turn this into this private spa that sits awkwardly like a beached cruise ship, squashing this island at the West End, cutting down 850 trees to do that, just makes no sense at all.
Well, that's the second time you've ended our segment by saying it makes no sense at all. The first one, we were talking about the Ontario Science Centre, this time about Ontario Place. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Ken Greenberg. We're talking about the provincial government's proposal just recently to move the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place and to build this big, massive spa at Ontario Place. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a really interesting conversation with Ken Greenberg, who is one of Canada's foremost critics from an urban affairs, urban planning standpoint, and has an incredible resume of history, and an author of a great book, which I pronounced wrongly previously. What's the name of the book, sir?
Walking Home.
Walking Home. And one can get it online and in bookstores, I presume?
You can.
It's an excellent book, even if I forgot the title. I apologize.
Okay.
I had one word wrong. One word
there
right.
Is another book called Toronto Reborn, which came out in 2018. And my wife Etty and I have a new book with Dunduran Press coming out in September called Exploring Toronto. And a lot of it is about the waterfront.
I look forward to reading it. Maybe we'll do another show on it. That'd be fun. Let's talk a little bit more about Ontario Place, if we could. I went to this one seminar in Manhattan about building cities at one point in time, and they said that every city to become a really world-class city has got to have something that the city becomes completely known for, and without it, you can't imagine the city continuing. And they said in Manhattan there were maybe three: Central Park, Times Square, and Wall Street. That you couldn't imagine Manhattan or New York without Central Park. You couldn't imagine it without Times Square, and you couldn't imagine it potentially without Wall Street. And they said, think about your own city, and can you imagine what? Can you tell me what the thing is about your city that you can't imagine the city without? And this was just before COVID, a couple of years, and my answer was the waterfront. It was the combination of the Toronto Islands, the Martin Goodman Trail, Ontario Place, etc. If someone asked you what is the one thing about Toronto that you couldn't imagine Toronto without, that it wouldn't be Toronto, what would it be, sir?
I think I agree with you. It is the waterfront, but let me broaden it out. It's our natural setting. Unlike Vancouver, where you can see the Rockies and you have these great views and you're on the Pacific Ocean, ours is a little different. Our ravine system, the rivers and creek valleys, have been described as an inverted mountain range, with these valleys draining from the height of land at the Oak Ridges Moraine, running through all of our communities in the 905, the inner suburbs of Toronto, and right down to Lake Ontario, are truly magnificent. Since Hurricane Hazel and we set up the conservation authorities, we're seeing them going from places we turned our back to because we were afraid of the negative impacts of flooding, into, as we deal with climate change in a positive way, seeing them turned into an incredible resource and opening them up as great trail systems, park systems, combining them with our lakefront. So instead of it being a narrow band all the way around the edge of Lake Ontario, which, and by the way, the name Ontario comes from a Mohawk word that means sparkling water. And it was describing the eastern edge, the eastern end of Lake Ontario and how the land met the lake. So if you combine those two things, the valleys, the ravines, with the lake, what we have is we live in a natural environment. And instead of continually trying to fence it off and suppress it and engineer it into domination, when we work with it, we create magnificent spaces. And there are examples of this happening all the way along our waterfront. And people are using it in a different way. Rather than going to one spot in a car or even by transit, we move along the waterfront. The number of people who are walking, hiking, inline skating, cycling, all kinds of ways of moving along the waterfront by the hundreds of thousands is truly remarkable. So to answer your question, I think when people, both locals, both ourselves, and when we have visitors and when we're hosts, come to our city, and we're not alone in that, but we have one of the best examples in the world of that. And what's happening at the Don Valley, this was a competition that I won with Michael van Valkenburg, the great landscape architect, for solving a floodproofing problem where the Don River comes into Toronto Harbor. An estuary of parkland is being created right at that point, entering the harbor. Waterfront Toronto is, which I mentioned before, is leading the charge. There will be this series of wonderful spaces from the beach in the east, from the Scarborough Bluffs, from the area, the outer harbor, from the Spit, from what's happening in Mississauga that I mentioned on your waterfront. And these are becoming more and more linked together, overcoming the gaps between them so that people can move along. And we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to David Crombie, who back in 1990 created something called the Royal Commission on the Toronto waterfront, Toronto writ large. And that led to the Waterfront Regeneration Trust in 1999, which has been working on this as a societal project ever since. And it's really all hands on deck. Some of it is private sector combined with city governments. Some of it is involving funding from the other levels of government, but it's kind of all coming together in a magnificent way. And that's why it was so startling to see this, I can only describe it as bizarre move by the provincial government, turning its back on the great legacy of its own party. And the great premiers of the day, John Robarts and Bill Davis, who had the vision for Ontario's place, going down there in 2018 after the last election and saying there's nothing there, it can be trashed, not recognizing anything of the genius of the combined work of Eb Zeidler and Michael Huff, the bones of which are all still there, and seeing that you don't have to create this great big bang commercial venture that will take it all over and try and turn it into a profit center. It's there as a great public resource, and its value is incalculable.
It does seem, though, that we've squandered that opportunity and that we're turning our back on what Ontario Place was. For me, the beauty of the forum was that it was outdoors, and
Right.
And now they're proposing to enclose it and make it year round. We've got enough enclosed year round places to see concerts. The beauty of the West Island for me was the different restaurants, kiosks, snack bars, etc., that you could go to outdoors and then wander around and go on a flume ride and then go sit on a park by the water. And the Cinesphere and the pods were spectacular, as you've described. A 65,000 square foot voluminous indoor spa just seems completely inconsistent with it. And again,
sorry, let me correct you. 650,000. 65,000 square meters.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I apologize. Even worse then. Why did we get into this situation? Again, when I was at Disney, we had an attitude we had to put in a new attraction every 2 years. Like Disney, the preeminent place to go from an attraction standpoint, still thought to keep alive, it needed to put something new in every 2 years. Did we just underinvest in it and forget about it and squander it?
Yes. And the reason, if you go back right to the roots of it, is the people who kept trying to monetize it as a piece of real estate simply were in denial about what it was created for, the fact that it was supposed to be about Ontario, about our land, about our people. If you go back to the inspiring statements of John Robarts when he introduced the idea, just as Expo 67 gave Canada a chance to speak to what it was becoming, its welcoming to the world, its embrace of nature, early ideas about an ecological approach to how we fit into the natural world, our diverse society. That's what John Robarts wanted to celebrate. And so then, having lost sight of that completely, and people scratching their heads and saying, we have this piece of real estate. The premier keeps talking about it as prime real estate. We've got to somehow make money on the site as a profit center, as opposed to seeing the economic benefit of having this great public attraction like Central Park is to New York. We don't try and make Central Park pay for itself. Yes, you have the Boathouse Cafe in Central Park, and people can go and have a meal in a restaurant, but basically Central Park is free and open. And so once you come up with that idea that you have to monetize it and keep coming up with more quote unquote attractions behind paywalls, then what we end up with is people scurrying around the edges of all these paywalls. And we now have learned that the premier is negotiating with yet another group in addition to Live Nation and Therme, the Austrian company with a spa, to do a huge nightclub on the site, another big paywall. And so, the public space is gone, essentially. And so that's why people are so incensed. And it goes back to what it is. If you define it the wrong way, if you define it as real estate to be monetized, then you end up with something like a competition for the spa. And what's funny about the spa, I've been talking about Robart's vision of this expressing Ontario. If you go on Google and you look at all of these mega spas that they have created, most of which are in rural areas in Eastern Europe, they're all the same. They look identical to the images we're seeing for the one that's proposed at Ontario Place. They all depend on a huge parking area, and they all operate the same way. It's like a vacuum cleaner. People come in, buy a ticket, they're inside for several hours, and then they're spit out, and they have no relationship to their surroundings. It's a formula. It's a template.
Which seems like the similar argument was made against casinos, that they end up being a self-contained thing that doesn't really have any synergistic value to the surrounding area.
In fact, casinos do exactly the same thing. They want people to come in. They want them to lose track of time and lose track of where they are, and to be wedded to the slot machine and completely self-absorbed inside. That's how it works. And this works very much the same way.
So I can't imagine this spa being built in Stanley Park or in Central Park or in Hyde Park in London, England, or in Luxembourg Park or something like that. Why are we putting it here?
It's so hard to understand. And then let me talk to one other aspect. Why would the government sign a century-long lease, a 95-year lease, the terms of which are secret? Why would we take a major asset and do that? Why would we provide a subsidy of $650 million to a private company in the form of the parking garage, site servicing, and clearing the land of 850 trees to this private company? Simply does not compute. And one thing we know for sure, even if this spa, which I don't think it would, even if it were in its own terms able to generate a clientele for a certain number of years, like all things of that nature, you were mentioning attractions that constantly have to renew themselves, that they don't last forever. This is such a purpose-built building. It will have a short half-life. I can guarantee that as an attraction. Then what? The province of Ontario, the people of Ontario are left with this contraption, which is so anti-environment in its conception. I've likened this to the ski hill, the indoor ski hill that was built in Dubai in the desert, where it's an energy hog to create an environment, the palm trees under glass, the 650,000 foot creature under glass. What do you do with it? We would inevitably, some future governments, not this government for sure, some future governments would be left with a white elephant of enormous proportion, very difficult to demolish, very difficult to repurpose, and with a lease. And at that point, the temptation to allow the leaseholders, whoever the successors of that leaseholding were, to do some other commercial venture on the site. So lost forever, essentially, to public purposes.
Fascinating conversation with Ken Greenberg about Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Ken Greenberg, a renowned urban planner, urban activist, author, public speaker, incredibly smart critique of what's going on in the Greater Toronto Area and Canada and around the world, about Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre and the current provincial government proposals for it. Mr. Greenberg, if you were Premier of Ontario, what would you do?
I think there are several things that are either in motion already, under construction, and ideas that other people have had, which could be combined in a really interesting way to clutch victory from the jaws of defeat, if I can put it that way. So we are building the Ontario line. The Ontario line, as I mentioned earlier, connects two of the great natural features in our region, the Don Valley and the lakefront. At both ends, we could do very positive things that are related to the great existential challenge of our time, which is climate change and reconciliation of our life on this planet with the natural environment, a science orientation. So let's improve the Ontario Science Centre in the Don Valley, but let's at the same time do what people are asking for, which is turn the parking lots along Don Mills Road into an element of a mixed income neighborhood with affordable housing related to the new Science Centre station and providing a better entry for the Ontario Science Centre. Let's make it real science, science that relates to the valley, to climate change, to all the things we're learning about how to live sustainably at the planet. At the other end, the Ontario line, Ontario Place, let's get rid of the spa. Bad idea. Let's go back to the original conception by Eberhard Zeidler and Michael Huff, which is there for the taking, this beautiful reconciliation of architecture and landscape. Let's create an adjunct, not a replacement for the Ontario Science Centre, a science-oriented adjunct, which fits into the plans of the US and Canada for research on the Great Lakes, a science orientation, education around science, and then a demonstration on the West Island, picking up on the work of Michael Huff, picking up on Indigenous inspiration of what kind of a magnificent landscape that could produce.
Thank you very much for joining us and sharing with us your critique of the current proposals and your idea for the future. Let me offer you an alternative as well to the two that we've talked about, the government's one and yours. I do think that we're squandering an incredible opportunity because the Ontario line really does solve the biggest issues that I think Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre had, which was lack of transit, that they were a little bit challenging to get to and you had to drive and park. And so we're giving up on these great, wonderful institutions just as we're solving one of their biggest problems. And so I think that makes no sense. I think on the Ontario Science Centre, it does need something new. And you talk about science and the importance of technology and science. I think the two that really are of most interest and critical today are climate change and maybe space. And so I think that what we need to do is rejuvenate the Ontario Science Centre. And I wouldn't put the mixed income there because I think there's more than enough multifamily residential that's coming there. But I think I would, rejuvenate the Science Centre, make it accessible by transit, and then add something new, like a major new center for climate change or a major new center for understanding space to a greater degree. Ontario Place, I think, and I actually worked on some developments back about 30 years ago for Ontario Place. And the example that we looked at, we went all around the world with smart people like yourself looking at examples, was Tivoli Gardens. And Tivoli Gardens really has been around for, I think, close to 100 years. And it really is a great combination of waterfront, park, and gardens and amusement. And people love to have amusements on the waterfront, particularly in the summertime. Whether you think about Coney Island or South Street Seaport or Pier 56 or 7, I can't remember which it is. In major cities around the world, there are examples of great amusement areas that combine waterfront, parkland, and entertainment together. And I think we've lost that. And building a 65 square meter or 650,000 square foot voluminous building just doesn't make consistent sense with a waterfront location. And so I think that something more like Tivoli Gardens, something more like South Street Seaport, where people go walk around and have a great, wonderful time, make a lot more sense. And I think you've got that amenity there, and to squander it to build this big, huge concrete hulk makes no sense. Anyway, that's what I would do.
Brian, can I add one more word to pick
Please.
up on what you said? I completely agree with you. And I'm going to steal a phrase from one of my landscape colleagues, Claude Cormier, who refers to his work as serious fun, the fun part. And Ontario Place had that originally. It was a place for families, for kids, for people to sit outside in the cafe, to have a beer on the water. That absolutely should be part of the mix and is not in any way incompatible with the original vision.
My mom grew up in Weston, and she used to talk to me about how she would take a streetcar to Sunnyside Beach, and that it was the thing that she enjoyed the most in the summertime in Toronto. And at the time, I think there was a Ferris wheel, there was amusement, and there was this great beach. And we've lost that. And that's what Ontario Place was for me when I was a kid, going to Sailor's Pub, going to the Forum, going to West Island, going to the Children's Village. I think we need to build it back. Anyway, Ken Greenberg, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thank you all for joining us as well. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, and you get all my podcasts and videos after the fact at briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.